Hey, what's going on, guys? My name's Griffin, and I'm a filmmaker based out of Orange County, California. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Canon 1DX Mark III versus the Canon 1DX Mark II. So I've actually owned the 1DX Mark II for close to 4 years now, and I actually just got the 1DX Mark III about 3 months ago. And I've had the chance to use the 1DX Mark II super extensively. I've used it on literally hundreds of jobs, and I really love that camera. We've used it for both photos and videos, and especially in the last couple of years, I've really used it mostly for video. So I know kind of the $1,000,000 question is, how does the 1DX Mark III compare to the new R5? And I'll definitely have a video coming up on that in the future. So if you're interested in that video, maybe consider hitting the subscribe button and keep an eye out for that one. Okay, so in this video, we're gonna be taking a look at some side-by-side comparisons in image quality, and we'll also be taking a look at some of the things that translate into real-world usability. Okay, so the first section is dynamic range. What I wanted to do is create a couple of real-world situations that you might actually find yourself in when you're out shooting. The first scene here is my fiance Delaney. She's sitting there on the couch, and this first camera is the 1DX Mark II. I think the image looks really good, looks really solid, and I tested in 2 different picture profiles. The first picture profile here, this is in neutral, and the contrast is dialed down just a little bit. And then the second picture profile here is Cine Style. And Cine Style is kind of like a flat picture profile because the 1DX Mark II doesn't have a log profile built in. And then as we click over here to the 1DX Mark III, the first picture profile is in the built-in C-Log. So right away here, you can tell the image looks really solid. If you take a look at the window on the right-hand side there, you can see it is not blowing out at all. And on the 1DX Mark II, it was pretty much completely blown out. So you can see there's a lot more dynamic range. And then now here's the RAW in the 1DX Mark III. I thought it was another step up over the C-Log that's built in on the 1DX Mark III. I think this built-in C-Log looks really good. One thing I noticed is the way that it transitions from midtones to shadows on the 1DX Mark III when you're shooting in RAW. It just looks a little bit smoother than it does when you're shooting on the C-Log compressed codec, which is the 10-bit 422. But overall, I think both cameras look great. I would definitely say the 1DX Mark III is a clear winner here. Okay, so for the second scene, which went out on a little hike, that was kind of close to our house. And the first section here, you can see, here's the 1DX Mark II. Again, I shot in both Cine Style and neutral. I think both picture profiles look really solid. You will notice in both of those profiles though, there's a little bit of clipping going on in her hair on the right-hand side. So if you take a look now at the 1DX Mark III, here's the C-Log, and you can see that there's no clipping whatsoever. I think the image looks really solid here. And you can just tell, even when you're pushing and pulling it and grading it, you can tell that you've just got a lot more information to work with, and the image isn't quite as brittle as the 1DX Mark II. And then now here's the RAW. So if you're looking for the absolute most dynamic range possible, then you're definitely gonna wanna shoot RAW on the 1DX Mark III. That being said, I think the C-Log that's built in, it's 10-bit 422. I think it's really a really solid option as well. Okay, and for this last test, I kind of want to create sort of a worst case scenario situation. So here's Delaney, and she's backlit by the sun, and you can see she is pretty much in complete shadows here. And then this is in the neutral profile, and you can just see those highlights are just completely blown out. There's no information there whatsoever. And then this next profile, here's the C-Log that's built into the 1DX Mark III. And when I saw this, I almost thought I screwed the test up or something because I couldn't believe it. It was such a huge difference. But you can see all that highlight information is there. And finally, here's the RAW from the 1DX Mark III. This one definitely clearly has the most dynamic range, but I would say the built-in C-Log to the 1DX Mark III and also the built-in RAW both have phenomenal dynamic range. So whenever a new camera comes out, you always hear people talk about, oh, okay, it's got this many stops of dynamic range. But until you see it in the real world like that, I think sometimes it's kind of hard to tell exactly what that difference might look like in footage that you're actually capturing. So when I saw that, I was pretty impressed at all the improvements on the 1DX Mark III over the 1DX Mark II. So another test I have coming up in the future is I'm going to be getting the Canon C300 Mark III in, and I'm going to be putting that against the 1DX Mark III as well. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be getting that EOS R5 in as well. So if you guys are interested in seeing some comparisons and tests, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. So one cool thing that Canon did was they included this electronic image stabilization into the camera. Like I mentioned, it's pretty much the same as the C500 Mark II, but it's pretty amazing, to be honest. So I did a little test just to kind of demonstrate the capabilities of it. So here's the test walking at 24 millimeters with the Canon 24-70, and this lens does not have image stabilization. You can see this footage looks kind of shaky, almost usable, but probably a little bit more shaky than what I want to use. And now here's when I turn the image stabilization on. like you'll just see it's pretty amazing. Like it almost looks like it's on a gimbal. Like if someone told me this was shot on a Ronin S, I'd probably believe them. So here's the test at 35 mil. This is where it looks totally unusable when you don't have the image stabilization on. And then once we flick the image stabilization on, it's probably a little bit jumpier than what I'd like to see. But that being said, I mean, it's still completely usable if you had to use it. Once you get to 50 mil, you can see, I mean, this footage looks insane. I would never use this in a professional edit, but we can see once I turn the image stabilization on, I mean, it's like, it's okay. You know, I would never do that on a real project, but just for the sake of the test, you can see what a big improvement that it did make. And then I also tested the image stabilization when we were just sort of standing there. So this is zoomed in at 70 millimeters, and you can see, I mean, it looks okay, and I'm doing my very best here to keep steady hands and keep from moving around too much. But then you can see, once I flick the stabilization on, you can see, I mean, it almost looks like it's on a tripod or something. So if your lens has optical stabilization, I'd probably just keep the electronic stabilization off. But if your lens doesn't have any stabilization at all, I'd say the electronic stabilization is a huge one. Okay, so next section, we're gonna talk about photography. I know these are both photo cameras and I've only been talking about video the whole time. So in terms of photography, they're both outstanding cameras, but the 1DX Mark III is quite a bit better. If you only need 14 frames a second and you don't shoot in live view, the 1DX Mark II is gonna be perfectly fine for you. But one major area the 1DX Mark III improves on is when you're shooting in live view. So personally, I like to shoot in live view because I'm a video shooter most of the time, and that's kind of how I'm used to viewing the image. So when you're in live view, you only get one shot tracking on the 1DX Mark II. And what that means is it'll grab focus on your subject and it'll be perfectly in focus there. And if your subject is, say, walking towards you, it does not continuously track that subject. So you can see all these photos, they're out of focus. If you're shooting in the regular through the optical viewfinder, all those photos would be in focus perfectly. But when you're shooting in live view, it's only got single shot autofocus. The 1DX Mark III has incredible face tracking and eye tracking autofocus, all the way up to 20 frames a second in both mechanical and optical shutter. So that's incredible if you're shooting sports or if you just want to be able to, say, track someone that's walking towards you. And then the other biggest benefit with the 1DX Mark III over the 1DX Mark II for photography, in my opinion, is the fact that you now can shoot with an electronic shutter that's completely silent. And it's not like really quiet, it's silent. There is no sound whatsoever. So that was one of those things, like back when I used to shoot weddings back in the day with the 1DX Mark II, like, and everybody would be like turning and looking at you, and you're like kind of embarrassed, be like, okay, I'm the photographer, I have to take photos, I'm sorry. But I know people were probably thinking like, man, can't that guy put it on silent mode? And the reality was, no, I couldn't. There's no silent mode on the 1DX Mark II. And maybe someone out there is thinking, hey, there is a silent mode on the 1DX Mark II. Well, the thing about the silent mode on the 1DX Mark II is it just kind of sounds like you have a broken shutter. It's not actually quieter. I mean, it's seriously loud as well. So I always would just shoot with the regular mode. And I have a couple friends with like Sony A9s and Sony A7s, and like back when we would shoot weddings together, they'd be like making fun of me, like, dude, can't you put it on silent mode? Like, it sounds like a machine gun. And like, on the one hand, it's kind of cool that your camera sounds like a machine gun. On the other hand, it's kind of embarrassing sometimes, and you might be in a sensitive situation, or say in just a practical sense, if you're shooting like, say, behind the scenes photos on a film set, like I use my 1DX Mark III for all the time. If you're recording video, most of the time you're recording sound. So it needs to be completely silent. If you're over there like taking pictures, like you're definitely gonna have people telling you like, hey man, you need to not be taking pictures when we're rolling. And so that's just sort of limits you a little bit. So in terms of autofocus, I'd say the 1DX Mark II and the 1DX Mark III are both outstanding. I've never had any problems whatsoever with the 1DX Mark II's autofocus. It does have two main modes you can choose from. The first mode is this flexi zone, and basically what you do is you tap the screen, you drag the box around, and it's gonna pull focus on whatever's inside the box. And the second mode is the object/face tracking. So this does a really solid job. And then on the 1DX Mark III, it's got a whole bunch more modes. The biggest improvement I would say is it's got eye autofocus, and it does seem a little bit quicker on the face tracking than the 1DX Mark II for video. I know one area that was kind of confusing when the 1DX Mark III first came out was which modes have autofocus. To put it really simply, every mode has autofocus in every frame rate except for the full frame 60p modes. So when you're shooting 4K 60p and 5.5K 60p, you lose out on autofocus. But what you can do is you can drop down to a crop mode, just like you get in the 1DX Mark II. So you can shoot in a 4K 60p crop mode if you are looking to have autofocus. So when you're shooting 4K video on the 1DX Mark II, it does have a 1.3 crop. The 1DX Mark II has basically all the same exact modes that you're gonna get on the 1DX Mark II, but it's also got a couple big improvements. So the 1DX Mark III will actually give you full frame, 4K 24, 4K 30, and also 4K 60. And it's also gonna give you full frame 5.5K RAW, and that's all the way up to 60p. So that's pretty amazing to have that built into a DSLR body. And that's really nice if you need it to complement something like a full frame cinema camera like a Canon C500 Mark II. So in terms of codecs, the 1DX Mark II shoots in a motion JPEG codec when you're shooting 4K. So a lot of people didn't like this codec when it first came out because it has big file sizes, but personally I actually kind of love this codec. It's got 422 color, and also it's pretty decent to edit on your computer if you've got like a modern spec laptop or iMac. So for the 1DX Mark III, it's got kind of two flavors of codecs. It's got both the compressed codec, which is really similar to what you're going to find in the 1DX Mark II. It's an MP4 codec, and that's pretty easy to edit, to be honest. It's pretty much the same as what you're going to find in the 1DX Mark II. And the downside with that though is you don't have any of the Canon log modes. Once you switch the camera into log mode, it automatically switches everything over to a 10-bit 422 codec, which is outstanding. The only downside of that is it is in an H.265 codec. So if you've ever tried to edit H.265 footage, it is extremely difficult on the computers. So you're probably gonna have to build proxies or transcode it to ProRes. And then probably the biggest upgrade that the 1DX Mark III has is it's actually got built-in internal RAW. So this is Cinema Raw Lite. It's sort of a love-hate relationship, I think, for most people, because you get this like outstanding quality that looks like it comes from, I mean, if you saw my C500 video versus the 1DX Mark III, you'll see that it actually looks really similar. I mean, it's like almost the same image quality. But the biggest downside is it is extremely hard to process on your computer. So you're probably gonna have to use a proxy workflow with that. But one bonus that you get with the 1DX Mark III is you can actually record proxies to a second memory card. So I'm gonna just call this the other notes section. I couldn't really think of a name for it, but there's a lot of small things that I kind of want to run through, and I didn't really want to drag the length of this video out too long. So here they are. So the first thing is the batteries. On the 1DX Mark II and 1DX Mark III, they use the same exact batteries and same exact charger. So that's pretty cool. But for whatever reason, Canon tweaked the formula, and now you can get significantly longer battery life. I'll put the times up here on the screen for video recording, and that's pretty cool. So you don't have to go buy new batteries if you already went out and purchased a bunch of batteries for the 1DX Mark II. Second thing to know is there are still recording limits on both the 1DX Mark II and 1DX Mark III. So the longest you can record at one time is 29 minutes and 59 seconds. So that's just something to be aware of. Third thing is the ergonomics are basically exactly the same. I mean, you can see both these cameras look almost identical. The only main difference is they added this touch joystick, which is pretty cool for controlling your autofocus, especially if you have an external monitor or like an Atomos Ninja 5 connected. One cool thing with the Canon log that's built into the 1DX Mark III is you get this thing called Display Assist. So it'll put a Rec 709 LUT, so it'll show, even if you're recording log footage internal, it'll still show your image on your screen with the full contrast and saturation added in. So it's actually a lot easier to gauge your exposure. And when you're shooting cine style on the 1DX Mark II, all you see is that flat picture profile. So it actually makes it quite a bit harder to judge if you have proper exposure, especially because both of these cameras don't have a built-in waveform, and then also the histogram goes away once you hit record. So having that display assist on the 1DX Mark III makes it quite a bit easier to gauge your exposure. Another huge improvement on the 1DX Mark III over the 1DX Mark II is the way that you play clips back. So when you're playing clips back on the 1DX Mark II, there's no touchscreen menus. So you have to press play, and then you have to basically use these wheels to scrub through your footage, and it takes forever. On the 1DX Mark III, it's actually touchscreen, and you can just literally touch and drag, and you can sort of scrub right through your footage. So that's definitely a nice improvement. Although I did find one quirk. For whatever reason, you get the display assist when you're recording the footage, but when you go to play it back on your camera, you can't play it back with the LUT on. So you can only play it back and look at the log footage. So that's just something to note. I mean, it's not a huge deal, but it definitely is a little bit of a quirk in my opinion. Okay, so another cool thing with the 1DX Mark III that was improved over the 1DX Mark II was the Wi-Fi. It is now built into the body. when the 1DX Mark II came out in 2015 and it didn't have Wi-Fi, I was kind of thinking like, man, why did they not put Wi-Fi in this camera when like the 5D Mark IV that pretty much came out at the same time had Wi-Fi. I bought Delaney 6D Mark II, that camera had Wi-Fi built in. And then here we have like the flagship at the time, the 1DX Mark II doesn't have Wi-Fi unless you buy this extra module. So I ended up buying it and it was like, I think it was $600 when I bought it, which is like, man, like that's insane. That's like so much money. But I bought it because I needed it. I needed it for the jobs that I was shooting at the time, and I needed the ability to transfer photos to my phone right away and do like same day edits for specific situations. And so I ended up buying it. So with the 1DX Mark III, the Wi-Fi is just built into the body. So the last sort of usability improvement over the 1DX Mark II was the 1DX Mark III now has focus peaking. Personally, I don't see that as a huge deal because I never used it. The autofocus was just so good for video. I would always stick to that. And especially if you're on like this little tiny 3-inch screen, it's like impossible to see like if your image is actually in focus. And in my opinion, I think you'd just be much better off using the autofocus and trusting that than trying to rely on the focus peaking. Even though it's there, it's nice, but I just don't see it being that practical. Okay, so last section, is the 1DX Mark III worth the upgrade over the 1DX Mark II? That's really for you to decide. I think there's a lot of quality of life improvements that make the 1DX Mark III a much better camera overall. I mean, it's better at every single thing. It's a better image, it's better usability, but is it worth the extra money? Or if you already own the 1DX Mark II, is it worth it to upgrade? I would say if you have work right now that you could benefit from all those improvements on the video side, then I would say go for it. I mean, I ended up upgrading and I couldn't be happier. Even knowing that the R5 is coming out, that camera's got 8K built in and 4K 120 and all these other things. But I think there's a couple of things that no one's really been talking about that I'm gonna have a video coming out on later. But stick around if you wanna see that and hear my thoughts on that. I don't think it's gonna be the camera that everybody's thinking that it's gonna be. All right, so that's it for me today, guys. If you like this kind of video, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.